Did you guys know that sometimes God uses people even when people make bad choices? It's true. John Wesley was used greatly of God to accomplish his purposes. Wesley preached the gospel on 2 continents, leading thousands of people to Christ. And Wesley was used of God in the Great Awakening in the United States of America to awaken many people of their need for Jesus. But he also made some bad choices in his life. One time he was walking on the road, or actually he was riding his horse, and he saw that a lady had fallen and had injured her ankle. And he went over there and helped her and wrapped the ankle and took her to her home. And he felt like, well, since God put this woman in my path, that must mean he wants me to marry her. And he ended up marrying her, and they had an awful marriage. He knew nothing about her. He didn't even know for sure whether or not she was a Christian. He just jumped to conclusions. And yet, even though it added a lot of trouble, it cost Wesley a lot of heartache, God still worked in Wesley's life. We see something similar with Samson in Judges chapter 14. Let's pick up the action. Judges chapter 14, in verse 1. Samson's marriage. You see what I'm doing here. Samson went down to Timnah and saw there was a young Philistine woman. When he returned, he said to his father and mother, "I have seen a Philistine woman." Don't you love it when your kid tells you everything? "I've seen a young Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife." What? There is so much wrong with that. Why don't we just start with this? According to the Torah, Deuteronomy chapter 7, Israelites should only marry other Israelites. You marry within your faith. Because the most important thing in your life is God. And if the 2 people who are getting married can't agree on the most important things in life, they shouldn't be getting married. And there's nothing more important than God and a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And without knowing any of that stuff, knowing that she's not an Israelite, Samson said, "Get her for me as my wife." Well, his parents questioned him on it and said, "Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives?" Yeah! Good question. Isn't there an acceptable person in the family, that distant relation, that loves God? Of course, it would have been better if it wasn't direct relation. Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife? You know, I like his parents, that they raised the question. They didn't say, "You're not going to marry her. You're an idiot." They raised the question in Samson's mind. Isn't there someone among your own people? Must you go to those who are not our people? There's a good strategy, but Samson said to his father, "Get her for me. She's the right one for me." And in the Hebrew text, it literally says, "She is right in my eyes." Well, isn't that one of the themes of the book of Judges, that people are doing what is right in their eyes rather than how it looks from God's perspective? That's the whole problem with people in the book of Judges, and that's the whole problem with our world today. We are looking at it through our eyes rather looking at things from God's perspective, having a heaven viewpoint, having a biblical viewpoint. Well, the next verse says that his parents did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, for at that time they were ruling over Israel. So what Samson did was wrong, but they also didn't realize that God was going to use this situation in order to confront the Philistines for the terrible way they have been treating the Israelites. This is how God used Samson when he made poor choices. Imagine how God could have used Samson if he'd have made wise choices. Think about that. You know, so often when it comes to finding a mate, we'll be like, God, I don't care what you say. This is the person I want to be with. This is the person I want to marry, and I want you to bless the relationship. Well, maybe God will, maybe God won't. But when you look at things through your eyes, rather than looking at it from God's perspective, it's always going to cost you more. It's always going to be more difficult. And in the New Testament, it's very clear that we are not to be yoked with unbelievers, that believing Christians should marry other believing Christians. And even if a Christian meets someone who's a Christian, they also need to know for sure how deep of a Christian are they. Is Jesus the most important person in their life? We talk about the marriage triangle in church all the time. Jesus is at the top of the triangle, the husband is over here, and the wife is over here. And if one person is reaching up toward God and the other isn't, they're closer to God but farther from their spouse. And the ideal Christian marriage is to when both people are reaching up to God, because the closer they get to God, the closer they get to each other. Well, Samson doesn't know none of that stuff. He just took one look at the woman, and love and infatuation at first sight. It's a powerful thing, but it's a dangerous thing. Watch what happens, man. Verse 5, Samson went down to Timnah together with his father and mother. You know, Samson is the most powerful, strongest person in the world. His mother and father could have easily been a little bit intimidated by him. As they approached the vineyards of Timnah, suddenly a young lion came roaring toward him. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, so that he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as he might have torn a young goat. But he told neither his father nor his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and he liked her. You know, he was so physically gifted from God. What he didn't have is wisdom. He had brawn, but he didn't have brains. He had devastating strength, but he didn't have discernment. Verse 8, sometime later when he went back to marry her, he turned aside to look at the lion's carcass, and in it he saw a swarm of bees and some honey. He scooped out the honey with his hands and ate as he went along. When he rejoined his parents, he gave them some, and they too ate it. But he did not tell them he had taken the honey from the lion's carcass. Now his father went down to see the woman, and there Samson held a feast, as was customary for young men. When the people saw him, they chose 30 men to be his companions. And this is when the drinking gets a little out of hand. And well, let's watch. Verse 12. Let me tell you a riddle, Samson said. If you can give me the answer within the 7 days of the feast, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. If you can't tell me the answer, you got to give me 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. Tell us your riddle, they said. Let's hear it. And this is the first game of Jeopardy that was ever played in the history of the world. He replied, out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. And of course, he's talking about how he found honey in the lion. But they don't know that. For 3 days, they could not give the answer. On the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife, coax your husband into explaining the riddle for us, or we will burn you and your father's household to death. Really? You're going to kill an entire family over a bunch of clothes that you could get at Kohl's in 2,000 years? Just kidding. Seems a little bit of a mighty overreaction going on here. And then they said to her, "Did you invite us here to steal our property?" And then Samson's wife threw herself on him, sobbing, "You hate me. You don't really love me. You've given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer." Yeah, I don't blame her for being scared that they might kill her and her family and burn their house down. She's got a right to be fearful about that and want to get help. But she should have said that to Samson. She should have said, "Hey, honey, these people are saying if I don't tell them the riddle, they're going to burn our house down." And Samson, the strongest, powerful man in the world, he could handle this stuff. He could have handled this situation, no problem. But instead, she's playing mind games with him. "You hate me. You don't really love me." Samson says, "I haven't even told my parents, so why should I tell you?" Well, that's not a good answer either. You know, the whole conversation shouldn't have happened. She should have just said they're threatening to kill us, and Samson should have gone out and taken care of business. Verse 17, she cried the whole 7 days of the feast. On the seventh day, he finally told her, because she continued to press him. She, in turn, explained the riddle to her people. Before sunset on the seventh day, the men of the town said, "What is sweeter than a lion? What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" Samson said to them, "If you hadn't asked my wife, you wouldn't have known." But metaphorically, he said, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle." Then the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. Remember, God allowed all this as a situation so that he could confront the Philistines. And that's what God's purpose is in all this, is delivering Israel from their enemies. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon Samson. He went down to Ashkelon, one of the 5 Philistine towns, on the west bank, struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of everything, and gave their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. So Samson paid up, but he made the Philistines pay for it. Burning with anger, he returned to his father's home. And Samson's wife was given to one of his companions who had attended him at the feast. You know, what a sad story. They were together for only a week. You know, the only wedding I can think of that was shorter than that, I think Britney Spears got married in Las Vegas 10 or 12 years ago, and she was married for 48 hours or 72 hours. But these guys were only married for a week. And then that's the way that ended. You know, God still used the situation to confront the Philistines, to begin his judgment upon them. But how much more? God can do way more with our obedience than with our disobedience. And so we look at this and we see how people make awful decisions when they choose things based on how they see it rather than checking to see how God sees it. I think the lesson for us is before we make a big decision, we need to pray. We need to consult the Word of God. We need to consult Christian people. The only feedback Samson had was from his parents, who said, "Well, you know, why are you going to the uncircumcised Philistines?" But Samson needed more than a word from his parents. He needed a word from the Father. But he wasn't listening. I hope that we take this lesson and realize that we don't just need great strength and resolve, we need wisdom. Jesus loves you. This I know, for the Bible tells me so. You guys have a wonderful day, and God bless.